Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Howell saying Ni Hao from Wuhan, China. I do hope to return to the land of the free and the home of my favorite ice cream, Breyer's Cherry Vanilla, in 2023. But for now, I enjoy fruit smoothies. So today, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Zhang Daqian, one of China's 20th century contemporary artists. I'll be covering Mr. Chong from a biographical and iconographic direction, even though Chong clearly lived during a time when some of the other theories could also apply. But just talking about his life and his work, I believe, will intrigue and hopefully fascinate you. So, why did I select Zhang Daqian? I'd seen a June 2022 CNN article on Chang, and it reminded me that I'd seen some of his work before when one of my students abducted me and took me to an exhibit in Qingdao, China. A couple of Zhang's works were on display, and back then I wasn't aware of his work in the Dunhuang caves, but I recall my student telling me that he'd been inspired by them. So while writing this paper, I learned about the incredible death and sacrifice that Zhang and his supporters gave in producing his version of those works. Anyway, let's go on to what this Zhang fan is going to talk about today. We're going to cover some key points about Zhang Daqian, his personal life, and events that I think have shaped his career. All too often, some of the great artists like Van Gogh, Edgar Allan Poe, Hemingway, and even one of my, again, contemporary favorites, Tyler Perry, had to reach rock bottom before rising to fame and riches. Zhang was supported by a very strong family, fans, managers, and even his wives who helped him overcome many of the issues he dealt with. So he's always had someone to keep him motivated and safe, and eventually prosperous. But Zhang's life introduced me to an interesting subject, forgery, and I hope to briefly cover his adventures with forgery, although based on several of the articles I've read, I'd be willing to meet those who think of forgery as criminal halfway and assert that under the right conditions, imitating the work of others does have some positive connotations. Before I continue, let me put in this disclaimer. Even though I've been in China for almost 7 years now, I'll have to admit it, I still haven't fully learned how to pronounce everything in Chinese. I've been working on it, so if I murder a few names, to anyone here who happens to be of Asian descent or in particular Chinese, I want to apologize in advance. So let's get started. So firstly, Zhang's actual name was Zhang Xingquan. Zhang came from Sichuan, China. And he came from an artistic family, and he was taught by his mother and his brother, Zhang Shangqi. Now, Zhang Shangqi was no slouch as an artist either. He was known for his tiger paintings. Now, Zhang sold his first commercial work when he was 12 years old. It's pretty impressive. He made fortune teller cards for a traveling fortune teller. At 17, Zhang went to Chongqing to further his education. Now, on the way trying to get back home, he didn't have enough funds, so he and several of his classmates tried to walk back home, and they were captured by a bandit group led by a guy named Qi Huayu. Qi forced him to write his own ransom letter, demanding 3,000 silver dollars. A lot of money back then. But when Qi saw Zhang's work, he made Zhang join the bandits and write kidnapping letters for the group. Now, he did go on raids with the group, but he only stole a few books. Eventually, Zhang was rescued and returned to his family. And later on, he went on to Japan to train there with his brother. But another tragedy occurred. While he was there, his fiancée and cousin, Shi Xunhua, got sick and died. So he returned to China to mourn and joined a monastery. Now, this is where he got the name Zhang Daqian. He was given the name Zhang Daqian while at that monastery. And he was pretty close to joining the monastic order when his brother rescued him before he completed the process. But while he lived at the monastery, he continued painting, and a lot of his work reflected Buddhist themes during that time. Now, later on, he began to study calligraphy, poetry, and guohe with several well-known Shanghai artists, including Shen Shi for calligraphy and poetry, and Li Ruqing for painting. Although I'm confident most of you know probably the definition of calligraphy, I just want to spend a moment clarifying them as they relate to artist Shang. While calligraphy is the art of producing decorative handwriting or lettering with a pen or a brush, for Chinese calligraphers, the addition of writing poetry in calligraphic form was a common practice in China. Now, that's not to say that people in the West did not do that, but I cannot think of a Western artist whose specialty combined both calligraphy and painting. So, as a part of his learning, Shang also learned poetry. And this particular scroll, for example, comes from a collection that Shang gave to one of his Taiwanese assistants whose family put them on display at their restaurant. Now, what is Chinese guohe? Chinese guohe is another way of saying traditional Chinese painting. Now, to qualify as such, painters applied paint or ink to silk or paper using brushes. And there were two different techniques, one called gongbi or gongbai, a method that uses highly detailed brushstrokes. And as you can see here from the examples, it was usually used when painting figural or narrative subjects. Ink and water painting was just more general, usually provided more color to a given painting. But again, I just want to make sure that we understood what those items are. As a result of Shang's training with these artists, he became proficient in duplicating the style of Ming and Qing dynasty paintings. Now, he also cultivated a special relationship with Pu Xinyu of Beijing, another master painter. Now, they collaborated on several paintings, and this collaboration was significant because Pu was from the north of China, Shang was a southerner, and there were regional variances in their work, but somehow they were able to create incredible pieces, where Pu might paint one part, Shang would paint the other. Now, his associations with these artists resulted in him doing exhibits during this time, most of which were received very well. He also sold a few paintings, some that were so skillfully reminiscent of ancient works that they actually fooled their purchasers. And again, there are a lot of stories behind that, but we're not going to get into it today. Well, we won't get into it during this presentation. Now, his fame brought him to the attention of Japanese occupiers during Japan's invasion of China in the late 1930s. They asked him to be the director of the Beijing Art School. Now, he declined. Of course, that didn't make Japan happy, so he fled with his family and supporters to Qingchen Mountain in 1938, where he spent 3 years working and selling more than 1,000 paintings, some to support himself and some to support the war effort. Now, Shang made a pilgrimage during this time to Duhuang, China, and the Magao Caves in 1941. Now, the caves were legendary for their frescoes, sutras, and other works, and this had been recommended by Shang's former teacher, Shen Shi, to Shang as an excellent place to study figure painting. Now, let me give you an idea of the scope of work that Shang was exposed to during this time. There are 812 caves in the Mogo Duhuang area, and out of those caves, 492 of them had various artworks in them. Now, this is according to China.org.cn. Now, so this led to the creation of one of Shang's largest single collection of works, which took 3 years to complete and resulted in 276 copies of Duhuang works. Now, after he completed those works and donated many of them, he tried to return to society, but he found himself facing problems with the newly minted Cultural Revolution. As it turns out, Shang was more of a nationalist than a communist, so clearly he wasn't going to do well hanging around there. So he fled and took his family with him, and he made stops in South America, Europe, and the US, where he did develop followings. But from his travels, perhaps the most significant was his meeting with Pablo Picasso, whom at that time was not known for his social graces. However, the two got along just fine, And eventually, Picasso not only asked Zhang for critiques of his work, but may have inspired Zhang to incorporate Western Impressionism in his paintings. Now, Picasso's influence may not have been the only reason Zhang decided to try his hand at abstract Impressionism. During a construction accident at one of his homes, Zhang's eyesight was damaged, and it didn't help that he also had diabetes. So with this issue, Zhang did begin to experiment with what is now known as the splashed color technique, and that led the way to his abstract expressionism period. Now, I want to briefly remind you how we define abstract expressionism. I'll read this quickly. Abstract expressionism is the term applied to new forms of abstract art developed by American painters such as Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and William de Kooning in the 1940s and 1950s. It is often characterized by gestural brushstrokes or mark making and the impression of spontaneity. Now, within abstract expressionism were two broad groupings: the so-called action painters, who attacked their canvases with expressive brushstrokes, and the color field painters, who filled their canvases with large areas of a single color. Now, I'm a fan of action painters, but Zhang was not defined as this kind of painter. He was more of a color field painter, and you can see what I mean in this short video of him working on one of his early pieces. Now, I want to remind you that Zhang did not abandon guoha entirely. He instead merged his skill with guoha into this splashed color style of painting, a technique not entirely exclusive to Western painting. In fact, if we take a closer look at some of Zhang's abstract expressionism paintings, we can see how he continues to retain some of the traditional shapes and colors prevalent in his guoha work. In fact, looking at his paintings from an iconographic perspective, the colors and objects used in a lot of Zhang's work have meaning that is important to the Chinese people. For example, the lotus flower is a symbol of purity, while the color red symbolizes happiness, success, and good fortune. But returning to the point at hand, Zhang's foray into abstract expressionism allowed him to combine the two disciplines. Regretfully, I have spent too much time laying out Zhang's life, but there is one final nuance that I want to spend a little time on, and that is the fact that among many art scholars, Zhang was also considered to be a forger. This is a topic that I could write an entire presentation on, as in my research, one of the things that I did not find was any direct evidence of Zhang actually having substituted one of his own works for the work of another artist. Instead, most of the stories I've read refer to him promoting ancient work done in the style of another famous artist, only for the buyer to discover later that Zhang had created the work. If nothing else, this level of deception is a testimony to the dedication to which Zhang applied himself in learning the techniques of the masters, deciphering and practicing them until they became natural. And in a society where art novices are encouraged to study the style of the masters, Zhang simply excelled at imitating them as well. To be fair, his study of the chemistry of the paints, paper, and equipment used at that time, as well as his inclusion of others to make false seals, is probably why many feel that his fakes were made with duplicity in mind. But in my opinion, they were also part of the survival mechanism inherent in artists, as many of them failed to make a living doing art. In conclusion, we've taken a very small look at the work of Zhang Daqian. The man's final years were just as colorful as the beginning, and to his credit, he worked right up to his death in 1983 in Taiwan. But today, China takes great pride in knowing that their former son's work is highly sought after, and in the last few years has at auction been purchased for millions of dollars. And in an ironic twist, Others have attempted to forge even his work. But if nothing else, Zhang's life is an example of dedication to craft overcoming great adversity. Thank you very much for listening.